Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson and Michael Grumbine.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 140.
Hello.
Welcome to you too, Michael, I guess we could say that. You're welcome.
No, I'm just saying hello to our people that are listening.
I know. Episode 140 of Exploring Tolkien and episode 27 of The Hobbit. We're doing the last half of perhaps one of the least eventful chapters in The Hobbit. What is this one called? Overhill? No. It's not called. It's called On the Doorstep. I kept thinking Overhill and Underhill. Anyway, it's called On the Doorstep. We're on the doorstep of Erebor, and we're going to get into that. And there's not a whole lot to say really. It's funny. Like I feel like this chapter was so boring and bland, but I didn't want to stop our process of really taking it slowly, step by step, going half a chapter at a time. I feel like that's giving us a really good insight and gives me some time to like really look at some things and examine some things I wouldn't normally have otherwise. So it's been a good journey. We do have also Tales of the Shire is coming out really soon. I know we're super excited about that.
Oh yeah, I've been holding my breath the whole time.
and there's still no announcement on season 3 of the Rings of Power. No official announcement. So I have a feeling they're trying to retool something. Something is in the bowels of Amazon is trying to figure out if they can save this monstrosity.
They can try all they like.
Yeah.
There's a rather crass phrase from my youth that applies here about pooches, but I think they've ruined it.
They've lightly turned the pooch. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
not lightly.
That's right. In a repetitively circular direction.
That's true. Well, in any case, we don't have a whole lot to talk about when it comes to anything outside of The Hobbit, which is kind of awesome. However, we do have things to talk about when it comes to our Premier members or just our members. You don't have to be Premier, you're just a member. If you go to theonering.com/member, you can become a member for $4 a month, or go to Patreon, which is at theonering.com/Patreon will work, and you can become a member there too for $5 a month. Your first month is free if you sign through us. Your first week is free if you sign up Patreon. But on, let me make sure I get this date correct. On July 7th, we're going to be doing our next chat. So this will come out before July 7th. So that'll come out a whole week before July 7th. So make sure you sign up, you join us. Hey, you can sign up, be free, and then cancel, and you can just join us for a chat. All of our members get an email along with the link in Discord with the Zoom link in order to join it. So you do need Zoom because you know what? We tried Discord. Google Meet is kind of iffy. So using Zoom just makes sense. So I'm sorry for you Zoom haters right there, but Just do it anyway, guys. You can just use the web version of it. You don't have to download the entire app. It's fine. But it's a fun conversation. Michael and I tried to smoke a cigar, both able to make it. And we talk about all those amazing ways that we've been experiencing Tolkien in real life.
Yeah. Connect the dots between what we read and the life around us as in this wonderful 21st century. So
yeah. All right. So let's actually jump into this episode. But first, as is our wont,
Hobbit Facts.
So, I'm running low on Hobbit Facts. This is getting hard. This is now number 27 I've come up
I'm
with.
impressed. You are very impressive, actually.
We'll see. They're going to get worse and worse. I'm really sorry.
Okay.
But well, I don't know. Maybe this chapter was a light chapter, and I try to make them a little bit associated with the chapter, at least, that we're talking about. So the idea, no spoiler alerts, because you have to have read this chapter before listening to us. But there's a thrush in this chapter, and the thrush knocks a snail against a stone. Right?
Yes.
And you're like, well, why in this prophecy would there be a thrush mentioned and still knocking on this stone? Well, as it happens, a thrush actually kind of picks its stone and sticks with it. So when a thrush is picks up a snail and whacks it against the stone, actually, I have a little video here for those of you who are watching on YouTube. If you watch this, let's go full screen here. You can see the thrush picking up a snail, and it's sitting on that same stone. And apparently, thrushes like to come back to that same stone over and over and over again. And in ornithology terms, it's called a snail anvil, right? And so this is what I read. Many song thrushes, in fact, choose a favorite rock as their snail anvil and return to it again and again, making the clue on Thor's map a plausible application of a real world bird-like behavior to the fantasy story. So, yeah. So they poor snail. I mean, that's what we do to fish to kill them when we whack their head really hard.
You bash them. Well, if we were Gollum, probably.
That's true. I don't know. Why is it so small? Oh, it's sharing the whole screen there. It's weird. Okay.
That's all right. They got the idea.
I went full screen on YouTube and it went half screen on for us. Anyway, yeah, that's kind of cool. So it makes sense. And again, later in The Hobbit, he does mention that these are, long-lived and magical thrushes. I think you use magical or something along those lines when Thorin mentions them later again. So these, they're
friends of the dwarves.
Yes, this could be the same thrush that was written about in the prophecy back in the day. So who knows?
Or it's also plausible that it's a family of thrushes. They're long-lived,
and this is their snail
throughout
anvil.
the year. This is their rock. I mean, it is a single gray stone in the midst of a little grass bay, they call it, which is the doorstep. From on the doorstep, it's the doorstep to the secret door. So not really a doorstep, but yeah. That's very plausible. There's another aspect of this which I find very curious and less plausible, but we'll talk about that as we get into it.
All right. Well, let's start talking about it then, Michael. You can give us the recap of this chapter. It's going to be like 45 seconds long.
Oh yeah, this is a super long recap, folks. Let's listen up.
Half chapter.
Just grab your coffee.
Take one sip and then we'll be done.
A cup or two. All right. So at the end of our last episode, which was halfway through the chapter on the doorstep, they had discovered the bay, this little grassy bay way up in the mountains, which you have to get to through a thin trail, a dangerous trail. What I mean by thin, gets thin in places. And so they're excited and they're heading up there. And the rest of this chapter is them sitting around waiting for something to happen, trying first to open the door. They know the door is there, and then they try unsuccessfully in a variety of ways. It turns out the door is magic and very clearly ascribed to magic. The fact that they're dwarf mining tools, one would think, are rather high quality. Dwarves don't do low quality mining, but yet their tools immediately bend like lead. The steel picks and stuff when they hit the door. So magic door doesn't open with picks, with mining tools. So they just sort of sit around getting glummer and glummer until finally a magical event occurs and the door opens with the key that Thorin has. But they almost miss it, and luckily they don't, because the Hobbit's there and remembers as things are happening. Although there's some very curious commentary that happens. It's to make this almost like a mini Deus Ex Machina sort of event, but that is a reality in some fairy stories, and clearly that's what Tolkien has chosen for this. So at the end of this chapter, the door opens, and the end. That's it. That's the chapter. They go up, they try to open the door, they aren't successful. They sit around for days, getting more and more depressed, and then finally, the last day of autumn comes, and the last ray of sunshine from the sunset comes, hits the door right in the right spot, and a keyhole appears, and they're able to open the door. So that's it. And then the chapter ends, and the next chapter will be the exploration of the secret door. But yeah, that's super exciting chapter.
Yeah, it's as a whole, the chapter, not much happens. Although I think again we are pointed to the fact that Bilbo solves the problem. Bilbo, like the dwarves again in this chapter, they give up so easily. They go through this, right? Tolkien writes that they went down the valley and up the newly found path and narrow ledge. They could carry no bundles or packs, so narrow and breathless was it, with a fall of 150 feet beside them onto sharp rocks below. But each of them took a good coil of rope and tied it. Anyway, they go through this process to get there, and then they just kind of give up when they're there again, right? Sure, their stuff has been broken, they've been there a night, but as Tolkien also wrote, like they essentially forgot about the entire prophecy. They were too eager to trouble about the runes or the moon letters, but tried without resting to discover where exactly in the smooth face of the rock the door was hidden. So they totally just forgot about everything. Thankfully, they had Bilbo, who had been looking at the map and was thinking about it, but he too seems to be, I don't know, he was not as engaged as I thought he would have been for somebody who was studying it, at least at this point.
Right. And I mean, as we discover, of course, there's not going to be any hope of getting the door open until the right time occurs anyway. So it doesn't really matter what they were going to do. And I couldn't find how long they were there. I
think it was just one night.
No, it says one day. Tomorrow begins the last week of autumn, said Thorin, one day. So one day implies that they've been
interesting.
there.
I didn't catch that one day, right? Because it's clearly they're there for the day. And then it says tomorrow begins the last, it said Thorin one day, but they don't talk about how many days he's there. They're there, all there.
Yep. And said, they sat and sit and think they did, or wander aimlessly about, and glummer they became.
Their plan was really bad. They still,
this is the thing. Okay, so here's where this is kind of the height to me. Everything. Let me start this way. Everything that happens after this chapter has much more of a realistic flavor to me. And by realistic flavor, of course, I'm referring to true realism in fiction, which is you have a world that you've created with rules and mechanics that govern this world, that make it the same as ours, or that make it different from ours. And you tell a story that's believable within that framework. This is the last chapter, and this is the last moment when it feels like, to me, except for a very distant hypothesis, which I can lay out, but it feels to me like this is less believable. This moment is less believable. And this opening of the door, for example, the fact that the dwarves have no plan, and the fact that they're useless except for this fat little person they brought from a domestic from a land with no war and no adventure all the way across the world, and he's supposed to be the one that saves them. Clearly, the dwarves up to this point, for the most part, except occasionally Thorin, in a moment or two here, a speech that he has to give before the Elf King or before the Master of Lake Town. Aside from that, this is a story about Bilbo, and the dwarves are just there to carry the story along. And so the fact that they would come this far, they would do this with no plan whatsoever, and then they blame Bilbo and start talking about how he's the one that's should be doing something now. And I know I'm getting a little bit into the beginning of the next chapter because I did read ahead, but that is they are the essence of useless. They are more useless than the seven dwarves in Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, who are just a vehicle for us to be a story to be told about Snow White and her evil stepmother and a prince. Yeah. So I think this is, as much as Tolkien disliked the Walt Disney Seven Dwarves, there's a similarity, which is that in both fairy stories, obviously, I prefer The Hobbit as a higher quality fairy story. But in both fairy stories, the dwarves are just mechanisms for the adventure that The Hobbit is having. I feel like after this, when we get into the relation, once the dragon is dead and Thorin, well, even the send-off of the dragon, even the conversation that Bilbo has with Smaug, and everything else that happens after that, Thorin and his, to use a modern term that I usually don't like, but Thorin and his dwarves gain more agency. They start acting more like they oppose, other politicians on their own. They develop plans. They hold battle. They do things without. They're just the dwarves in 2 chapters from now or 3 chapters from now are totally different from the dwarves here. And the dwarves here, and I think it's capped off. I'll just say, to me, the opening of the door is sort of this moment, which is the last of the dwarves as fairy story dwarves who are just vehicles for a motive, a motif inside of the story that has not much to do with them as persons. And here's what I mean. Supposedly, Thorin's grandfather makes this. Thorin's grandfather, Thror, makes this map, right?
Yeah, right.
So when he makes the map, we found out from the rune letters that it says that the moon letters that Elrond reads say, and I had to look this up again because I couldn't remember. Stand by the gray stone when the thrush knocks, and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole. Okay, so you made a map. So the dwarves create. So if you want to make this realistic, the dwarves in ages past made a secret doorway into their mountain, which was built to open 1 minute every year. That's it. Because Durin's Day comes once a year. It's the day when both the last moon, which would be the waning crescent, is in the sky with the sun on the last day of autumn. So that's Durin's Day. So 1 day a year for like a minute, there's a light will shine on. Maybe if the light isn't blocked by clouds, light will shine on the right spot, and by magic the keyhole will appear. And if you have the key, you can then open the door. This is ridiculous. Like from a realism perspective, there is no way that a dwarf that this makes any sense to carve a whole passage for a door that only opens 1 minute a year. And so it's simply, and the fact that they would have just happened to be there at that time, what that argues for is chance, if chance you call it, is providence from the Lord of the Rings. That's the only plausible explanation that I can give for it. Other than that, it's Deus ex machina, and now these kinds of things though do happen in fairy stories where a thing happens which has little to no rhyme or reason, but you just roll with it. But in this case, this is a mechanism for the dwarves to complete their quest, and it smacks of that older fae. This has no rhyme or reason beforehand, but we're just going to roll with it afterwards feeling to me, and less like Lord of the Rings. But from here on out, the dwarves behave much more like agents, like they would, like characters from the Lord of the Rings do. So I see this, I know I've said this before in other parts, but I see this as another point of transition from the older fairy story that Tolkien is sitting around a fire telling his children, and the full-blown secondary world epic that he's going to craft for Lord of the Rings. So anyway, long-winded, but I see this as a moment of transition in that regard.
Interesting.
What do you think?
There's a lot. So I have two thoughts. Let me start with the door, and then I'll move on to some thoughts about the dwarves. So the door, we read that when the light hits it, a flake of rock splits from the wall and falls. Right. So does the rock regrow over the stone every year when it happens, or is this really only the first time that's ever happened?
And that flake of stone was the one covering the keyhole.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yes, precisely. And so is there it's the fortuitousness of being there on this exact day and it never having happened before, and they see the keyhole there, is a little harder to believe when it comes to like it's the real world. This is the real way a story would tell. However, when it comes to being a backdoor, if this backdoor was created, years and years ago, there could be reasons for kings to have these backdoors, perhaps for treachery.
But even the king can't get back in the back door except 1 minute once a year.
But at least he could get out, and he'd know how to get back in if he had to
okay,
come there.
So an escape
I don't know.
hatch.
I'm trying to play devil's advocate for the positive nature of this.
That's totally believable except for the inscription part and the fact the door will, even if you are the king with the key in your hand, you can only open this door 1 minute once a year. So
that's true.
So that part of it is just, it's too fabulous. It doesn't have that grounding that most of Tolkien's secondary world has. So I just think it's this overlap between a story he told his kids, a fairy story he told his kids by the fire, and Middle Earth as he has been creating it.
Yeah, that seems plausible. And that brings me to my other point about the dwarves. And this is something we'll get into in the extended edition, which I forgot to mention actually at the beginning. So make sure that you become a member and get that, so that we can hear our extended details about this idea of the dwarves. And when Tolkien first wrote about the dwarves, in Middle Earth, because most of it was really about the elves, right? The elves were who
Right.
he really wanted to talk about, but the dwarves, they had their place. But when did he first write about the dwarves? Well, we'll talk about that. But his first endeavor into dwarfdom, the dwarves were evil. The dwarves were not good folks.
Yeah, the petty
And
dwarves. Yeah.
the petty dwarves. But even then, like they were like the story of the Nauglamir, where the dwarves come, they want they put the Silmarils into a beautiful necklace, and then they want it back from Doriath, from King Thingol. That story made the dwarves out to be, petty, but also violent and greedy, like all the bad things. About
Very greedy, very corruptible. You do have to balance, though, the fact that prior to the Nauglamir, you have the dwarves helping the elves at the Battle of Sudden Flame.
True. However, we'll talk about this in the extended part. Is that it was originally called the Nauglafring in one of his early stories in the Book of Lost Tales. So that he wrote it far before he wrote any of those other stories. He wrote about this here, and so the dwarves were evil. This is when, though, like I think when he wrote The Hobbit is when his approach to dwarfdom changed. And he started seeing them as better than who he'd written them to be before this. And this came out of him telling the story to his children. And so I think there was still this, we get Gimli in The Lord of the Rings, who seems completely different than Thorin and Thrain and Bifur and Bofur and everybody. Like he is a good man, right? And he is the one who's touched the most by Galadriel, right? So we can't see any of these dwarves being that way. However, that pettiness of these dwarves, their ability to not do the right thing most of the time, still shines through even in this chapter here, where they're like, let's just send Bilbo right through the front gate again. Why if we can't get through the back gate, he's got a ring. Let's throw him through the front gate. And then Bilbo always is like, well, it's always me that you're coming to. It's always me that has to save your butts. So I think this is the point of transition for the dwarves, from the evil dwarves that he had been writing, or had been at least had been a part of Middle Earth at that point, to something more, to actual characters with dynamic personalities that can become good.
Yes,
and so I agree. I still see we see that original attitude toward the dwarves still coming out in certain instances in this chapter, and maybe this is where he made that turn. Like you said, this is the turning point. He made that turn to where they have the agency in order to do the right thing moving forward.
Now they're going to continue. Thorin's going to get worse once he gets his kingdom back.
Yes,
but worse before he gets better, and by better I mean dead, and then better right before he dies.
Right.
So Tolkien is still, dwarves are still people of fairly low character, but by the time we hear tell of Balin and Gloin in the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien has definitely made a shift. And Gimli, as I've said before, is frankly, he's knightly. He has chivalric values with regard to Galadriel. His attitude towards when he's explaining to Legolas about the glittering caves, and the dwarven attitude towards that, and his character throughout the Lord of the Rings is just he's totally different. His father was of a different stock, and not better than at least in this. Although we don't obviously hear much about Gloin in this, he wasn't one of the main dwarven characters, but yeah. Anyway, it's a real shift, and I think I just see it as having the two stories having different sources that then Tolkien decided to meld them together. I mean, there are no hobbits in the Lord of the Rings until he decides to meld them together. When he's writing the Silmarillion and such, there aren't any mention of any people that are like hobbits, right?
Yeah, no, nothing.
I don't even think the Unfinished Tales have any hobbits in them. The hobbits are entirely the product of his fairy story he told his kids, turning into a book and then melding that into Middle Earth.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about Bilbo, since you just mentioned him again.
Yep.
I loved in this chapter, where Bilbo, he is like the first thing that really, like, he's dejected. He's sad too, but why is he sad? Because he was not thinking much about the job. He was thinking about what lay beyond the blue distance, the quiet western land, and the hill and his hobbit hole under it. And so I think like we identify better with that idea of Bilbo. Like we just don't give up, but Bilbo just wants to get back home. And so I love the way that he quickly reminds us that like this is why Bilbo's here, and this is why he's going to do the right thing, because he has that home to go home to again. And again, they mentioned the whole like this is the doorstep of the mountain, and that's the doorstep. It drives that's what prompts Bilbo to think about that again. It's like, oh, it's just like the doorstep back home, like when you came to visit me on the doorstep.
That's our grounding. Like we don't have much to sympathize with. Well, I don't know about you. I don't have any friends that have kingdoms they want to try to reconquer or take back from a dragon or anything. But we can all identify with the love of home when you're far away in a strange place. Yeah. And that's why the hobbits are the most endearing of all creatures of Tolkien's Middle Earth.
Yeah, I also think he's not so much frightened anymore. Yeah, he used to be very frightened of everything around him. Now he's just annoyed. He thinks this.
He's tired of adventure,
right? He's like, so when when who's it? Dwaylen says, "I'm beginning to think that the Hobbit might go through the front gate and spy things out a bit." He thinks to himself, "Good gracious! So that is what they're beginning to think, is it?" Like it's a little bit. It's like he feels affronted. Like, really? Now that's what you're going to think, is it? It's always poor me that has to get them out of their difficulties. At least since the wizard left. Whatever am I going to do? I almost feel like that's a little sarcastic. Like, whatever am I going to do? I might have known that something dreadful would happen to me in the end. I don't think I could bear to see the unhappy Vale of Dale again. And that's for that seeming gate. But I don't feel like the fear isn't there. It's more the annoyance. Like, oh, these dwarves again. And so, and I think the fear is that if there is any fear, it's that I'm not going to be able to get home anymore. Not, I can't do what's in front of me.
Right. He doesn't seem to care that much about what's in front of him, except he has some sort of pride in his job that he's been hired to do. This is a very English thing, by the way. This is sort of like, I've stopped caring about you all because you're a pain in my rear end. But I did agree to do the job, so I'll do the job, and then get on. And it's not like he doesn't like them. Although one wonders at certain moments, but they are, one of the things I find interesting about the story is there's no close friendship. There's one mentioned with Balin or Dwalin that he was a little warm towards the Hobbit, but besides that, there's nothing. There's no Bilbo doesn't develop any friendships with any of the dwarves in particular throughout this whole journey. This is another point which adds to my my thesis that the dwarves are more story mechanisms and less people, because it's almost like there aren't real, like Philly and Killy are real people, and Thorin's a real character, and the rest of the and Bomber's a laughing stock, and the rest of them are just kind of there to move things along, and he'll pull names out of hats, when it comes to which one this or that happened to, and so or said this or that if it's not going to be Philly, Killy, or Thorin. So and even with Philly, Killy, and Thorin, we don't hear that Bilbo has any great warmth or friendship different from any of the other dwarves, and it doesn't talk about him being friends with the dwarves either. There's some passages where you can say, well, this is kind of like a friendship, this affection or this care that he has for them, but it's not. Well, it's not really.
It's sort of like when you go through trials, tribulations, disasters together, there is some sort of bonding,
right? But I think about like the military in that regard. So that often happens in with disasters with or really rough spots in the military. But there's a greater bond with the people. I just don't see that bond with Bilbo.
I agree, but the bond is that they, time is just their bond at this point. That they've gone through this together, and that they have a relationship based on the necessity of the journey. I don't know, like, is there even respect? Like the dwarves, I don't know, I can't remember if he uses the word respect, but they certainly valued Bilbo more at this point. But I don't know, does Bilbo respect the dwarves or any of the dwarves at all at this point? I don't think so either.
I don't think there's a single indication. I think the dwarves grow to respect him a little bit more. There's a few sentences about that. But the attitude Bilbo has towards the dwarves is irritation.
Yeah, right, exactly.
He's frustrated with them. He's irritated with them. He's tired of their shenanigans. And frankly, as a reader, I kind of am too. Like, they're fairly, like, for a supposed king and his retinue of loyal followers that are supposed to be winning back the king's kingdom with him. They're all rather pathetic, and they're also mean spirited, and they remind me of like badly behaved children. And I've had a lot of those over the years.
And I think that's how Tolkien saw them as dwarves, right? That was how he that was
that could be
from the Norse mythologies. They weren't great people either, and so it carried over into how he told the stories.
Yeah, these are very Norse.
But then I think he realized he had to change them. He had to make the characters dynamic. He had to at least give them some sort of positive reason for being other than
right.
And I think we see that as we move forward, and we'll see that further.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, there's not a whole lot to say in this chapter other than I really like the last full sentence of the chapter, and it goes back to what we talked about.
I was going to bring that up too. Good. Good.
The last episode, we talked about he gives life to the mountain, that it's not just Smaug. The mountain is there, right? The arms of the mountain. It feels like you're being sort of encompassed by it and held by it. It's not an inanimate object that you're just walking on or that you're just hiking through. It's actually something living and breathing, which brings us to this line. Let me read it. After they opened the door, a door 5 feet wide, 5 feet high, and 3 broad was outlined and slowly without a sound swung inwards. And then here's the last sentence. It seemed as if darkness flowed out like a vapor from the hole in the mountainside, and deep darkness, in which nothing could be seen, lay before their eyes, a yawning mouth leading in and down. Just a great way of again giving us this idea without saying, like, this is like you're walking into the mouth of the danger that you have, that has been, its arms have been around you now you're actually deciding to be swallowed by it. And it has that vapor, and we talked about the vapor that comes out off of the out the front door too that we see. And now it's the darkness that flows out like a vapor. So there's seriously something about what the dragon is doing inside the mountain that brings out this. Go ahead.
Yeah, we mentioned it before too, right? That Ungoliant emits darkness. Shelob emits darkness, like actual darkness comes out of them, and especially Ungoliant. And so now we have darkness flowing like a vapor. We have hints of that in the front gate. And the idea that, like, the land is still desolate all around the Lonely Mountain, hundreds of years afterwards, which is not normal. It should have regrown, because it's not like the dragon just comes flying out every week and burns everything down again. There's something about the tangibility of evil and darkness in Tolkien's world at various points, and dragons being fully evil creatures, like orcs, like trolls, like the great spiders. They're just corrupt existence. It would make sense that darkness, which is a lack of light, is a kind of thing that they surround themselves with. They maybe emit, especially the bad one, the really powerful ones. And so that part was also fascinating to me, and I love the mountain yawning its mouth open for them to enter.
Yeah, it's a very small mouth, but it still leaks out darkness.
Everyone there is a dwarf or a hobbit, so it's not as small as it would be to us.
No, that's true. 5 feet tall, 3 feet wide, 5 feet high, 3 broad. Yeah, yeah, great. I think his writing has gotten better as the book progressed. Actually.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And it even goes to just one other line to bring up here. Let me scroll over to it here. And I think I did read it earlier. In any case, where he talks about how they carried themselves, or they walked along the narrow and breathless path of the ledge.
Tying ropes around their waist, you mean?
Yeah, so they could carry no bundles or packs, so narrow and breathless was it, with a fall of 150 feet beside them onto sharp rocks below. But each of them took a good coil of rope wound tight about his waist, and so at last, without mishap, they reached the little grassy bay. Okay, it's still a short phrase, a short bit of prose that gets us to where they need to be, the little grassy bay. But I wanted to compare that a little bit with what he said when Bilbo and the dwarves witnessed the rock giants, the stone giants, throwing things, and they had their thunder battle. This is all that he wrote when they went up into that ledge. He wrote, "They were high up in a narrow place with a dreadful fall into a dim valley at one side of them." And that's it. Like there was very little. And so I think he understood, like at this point, like he'd gotten better. He knew that in order to give, to build the world for the reader, you had to give a little bit more than it was narrow and it was a dreadful fall. No, there was that little bit of extra description. Now, again, there's a point at which, like, if you say there was 150 feet and the sharp rocks were like the teeth of a dragon below, while the river scurried along like a chipmunk through the forest in Neldor, right? There's no, like, you have to stop it at a point.
Go too much.
And he gives just enough to give you the feeling like, look, it's precise. They're 150 feet, but they still, like, they're just sharp rocks. So there's death. And they had to be safe. So they took a good coil of rope, not just a coil of rope. It was a good coil of rope because they had to be safe. So all these little words, all these little things are far better than they were high up in a narrow place with a dreadful fall into a dim valley. And so, yeah, I think in that time he had improved his I
agree. I think you and I put our finger a little bit on the start of that, because we found a difference between the passage between what you had just read about the giants and the whole goblin excursion under the mountain, the Goblin King and the finding of the ring and stuff. After that, when the dwarves are trying to put some distance between them and the goblins, and they're going down the mountainside on the other side of the Misty Mountains, he starts getting into the details of the geography, and we see that this is the kind of thing that Tolkien, I feel like the world's being fleshed out in his own mind. Yeah. And so he gives us more of that. And
I think he's brought it completely into Middle-earth, right? That he's now seeing it as something that's not just the stories of his children. All right, guys. Well, that was, we can always squeeze so much out of these chapters. I love going through it with you. However, I'm going to squeeze even more out of you, Michael, because we have a Warhammer thing that we have a question for you in our extended podcast.
Oh, no.
We'll get into. And then I have a few comments from YouTube that are kind of fun that we want to talk about, some thoughts about that. And then we're going to talk about the dwarves and when did Tolkien introduce dwarves into Middle-earth? How early was it really? So I did some research, and I think I found the first point at which he mentions dwarves, I think. So obviously, I'm not like Wayne Hammett or Christina Scull, who have written like the companion books and like have this whole like the all the poetry of Tolkien in one.
Oh boy,
thing where they put together. I'm not that, but I can use their knowledge in order to try and find the answers to what I have. So we're going to go over that. So if you want to hear that, become a member. thewandering.com/member. Thanks to Lynn and Rich, who continue to support us more, but it's just $4 a month, guys. You can go to thewandering.com/member, thewandering.com/Patreon, and join up. So we hope to see you on the other side, everybody. We're talking Warhammer and Tolkien. See ya.
Goodbye, freeloaders.